Martin. So yeah, I'm delighted to be talking about virtual CST today. It's some work that we've been thinking about for a long time, but I think in the last few months it's become very much in people's minds, and there have been so many questions about whether CST can be delivered virtually because of the obvious restrictions in place. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what's happening globally on this this morning. So firstly, and very briefly, I imagine most people here know what CST is, but just as a very brief summary, it's cognitive stimulation therapy. It's the only non-drug therapy which is endorsed by the NICE guidelines to improve cognition, independence, and well-being. And I think this is from the latest NICE guidelines. And I think this is largely because there are global trials which are consistently demonstrating improvements following CST when it's been translated into different languages and cultures. So actually, there's some pictures at the bottom of this slide of the manuals from Hong Kong, Japan, Germany and Italy are just some of the countries that have started to use CST. And what we're finding consistently is that all the trials are generally showing improvement in cognition, and that there's increasing evidence for benefits to quality of life, mood and carer well-being as well. And there's also consistent evidence for its cost effectiveness. And there's three types of CST which we think about. There's firstly group CST, which I'm going to be focusing on this morning. There's also maintenance CST, which is a longer version of CST, which we often see delivered once a week for periods of perhaps up to 6 months. And this is often through third sector, such as Age UK. And then individual CST, which is CST delivered one-to-one, sometimes by a family caregiver. So very briefly, it follows 18 key principles, which are largely based on the idea of mental stimulation and the idea of using new ideas, thoughts and associations, making new semantic connections. And the themes, there's 14 theme sessions, which kind of cover the typical activities that you might do in day centres, but very much linked to these key principles. And it's all about keeping people mentally stimulated. So, and one thing to say also is that we know that CST is being offered by most memory services. It's a type 1 standard for MSNAP memory services. I know about 3 years ago, there was a survey suggesting it was delivered in around 85% of memory services, but we're thinking that that number will be now higher. So obviously with COVID now, people aren't able to deliver group CST, and there's this big question about what to do. So just thinking, the background of this project is very much thanks to Hong Kong University, who planned this way before the COVID-19 outbreak. They were finding that there were lots of people with dementia who couldn't physically join groups. People had problems with mobility, but also there were lots of logistical challenges getting to groups, people living in tower blocks, struggling to make groups. And I think ahead of us a bit in technology. So they were very keen on thinking, can we emanate what we're doing in groups on a platform such as Zoom to connect people with similar backgrounds, interests, languages beyond the geographical boundaries. So they set up this study, which actually started at the beginning of this year, but the ideas developed before and will end next December. And it's very much about the feasibility, acceptability and modification of CST groups through Zoom. And we're working on the feasibility and acceptability now, but by the end of next year, there'll be a big randomized controlled trial. So once the pandemic set in and all my research projects were falling through, we suddenly thought, well, that this is the opportunity to be actually doing something really helpful that's addressing a big clinical need. So we set up a project quite quickly here at UCL using trainee clinical psychologists who'd lost their other projects. And the idea was to look at group CST, so following the standard 14-session manual, which is 2 sessions a week for 7 weeks, via Zoom or a similar online platform. We're still not completely sure which platform we'll use. And actually in the last webinar that we had, I did a quick question. I asked people if they could quickly type in the bar what platform they use the most. And it seemed like Zoom and Teams were the 2 most popular platforms, with others coming after that. So the plan is, first of all, in July, to have some focus groups with professionals who've actually tried online CST, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it looks like there are a few people around who've actually given it a go, and we really want to try and get feedback from them initially, so understanding the barriers facilitators and some of the modifications to the programme that are going to be required in order to be able to deliver it online. And we're also going to have some focus groups for people with dementia and caregivers, because we want to ask them what's their experience of technology, which platforms are they most comfortable with, what might be the barriers to them in terms of length of time and other things that we might need to support. And we'll use all the feedback from these focus groups to design the virtual CST programme. And then between August and December, we're going to be testing it. We'll do a small pre-post feasibility study with a small number of people led by 2 psychologists. And what we really want to understand is whether people can engage in new CST groups online. So most of the people we know who've tested it out have actually continued with groups that are already established. And we want to know whether we can start new groups with people who haven't met before, whether they can recognize each other, whether they can engage, whether they can follow the session, the content, the technology, whether we find any benefits, and also have an understanding of who might be more suited. So we're kind of making the assumption it has to be people at very early stages of dementia, but it may be people who have a family caregiver to help, but it may be that there are other things that we need to consider as well in our guidelines. We'll look at simple outcomes, so cognition, quality of life and mood, and we'll also record sessions and use qualitative interviews to try and understand the experience, the process, etc. We've also just applied for funding to try and make it this a more substantial piece of work as a feasibility randomized controlled trial, where we'll also look at cost effectiveness and implementation more widely, because I think one of the big arguments here is that this is going to be something that we're going to need for a long time. People are going to take a long time to be using services again. There's a lot of excess disability. There's lots of people who are going to be very nervous about going out. And the other thing, you know, we replicated here is what they found in Hong Kong, that there are often people who can't access groups because they can't get to them because they're too ill, they have no transport. So actually this is really something we might want to consider in the longer term. So very briefly, I was going to just give some feedback. We've got several people who've tried this out, and I think we can learn things from them, because I know many of you might be wanting to do this now rather than wait for the research to be done, and just to have some tips on how to do CST virtually. So a team in New Zealand, Gary Chung and Kathy Perry, have kindly said that I can share some of their ideas. They've been running some groups through Zoom, existing groups that they've continued through Zoom. When they invited everyone who was involved in CST, they found around half have access to Zoom. This is a small sample, and I guess it might change. I think if everyone here thinks about how comfortable they were with Zoom a few months ago and how they are now, I think this has changed quite quickly. Their suggestion was between 3 and 5 in a group is ideal. 4 is probably the best number. You don't want more than 5, because of course people have to see everyone on the screen, and you're also on the screen delivering some of the session material, so otherwise it becomes too much information to look at. They found that some people who live alone can be coached to join Zoom via phone, so they'd ring people up and they'd talk it through on the phone, which was positive, because we were maybe assuming that people would need someone there to support. But they said that a one-to-one pre-training with a supporter or caregiver did really help, and having someone there to provide support was obviously beneficial. They found that the role of the co-facilitator was really, really important, that there's so much managing of the connection and technology, and that was really needed to leave the main facilitator to focus on running the group. And they often found that they were needing to phone people up and coach them to join a session. They were having to monitor the video and audio functioning, checking that people's names were correct on screen. We found that a few of us had the same name when we started this. So those kind of things. And of course, for people with dementia, this is really, really important. They also said that you need to be able to check that people can see and hear from their device. Thinking about the icebreaker at the beginning was difficult. So when I run groups, we normally pass something around or throw a ball, and it's quite tactile. So sometimes things like getting people to put on wigs or changing the virtual background could be a good way of doing that. They found that in terms of delivering the activities, having a PowerPoint presentation did work. So you share the screen. So perhaps what we're seeing here, where you'd have perhaps the faces session and you could have faces and also see the group. But it was also really helpful to deliver back resource bags, that actually having something physically in front of people, having handouts or something might potentially be better. It means that there isn't so much information on the screen, that it can be more tactile, and actually encouraging people to bring things along to sessions is helpful. And their overall feedback is that people can recognise each other online, and they can reconnect virtually. They could follow the activities, and they appear to be having fun. Hong Kong also, they've been trying this work out. They found that Zoom is manageable. Zoom CST is manageable in some people with mild to moderate dementia. Many didn't have any previous ICT experience but were still engaging. So they gave the example of a 92-year-old lady who was completely new to Zoom, who said, "I feel like a celebrity." So she was very excited about that, because I think seeing herself on the screen made her feel like a celebrity. And also carers were saying that people's mood seemed to be better. And the other thing they picked up was the novelty and empowerment that some people seem to be getting from mastering new technology, which was a very a new experience and empowering for them. They said, similar to New Zealand, that there's a lot of support needed to set up the devices. There was problems with network, which of course we all have when a Wi-Fi isn't working. Things like making sure the microphone was properly set up is really important. They picked up on attention, that sometimes people struggle to engage for an hour, and we might need to think about shortening the sessions. But some of the other groups said actually the time goes by quickly, and often some of that time is dealing with technology problems. And the facilitators generally said that it was more challenging managing the dynamics of online groups than actual groups. And finally, to mention Memory Matters Southwest, who I think are here in the audience. They've been doing some great work testing CST groups through Zoom, and have very helpfully created a YouTube clip, which is on my last slide, where you can actually see some examples of CST through Zoom, which I actually found really helpful, just because it's sometimes hard to visualize what it looks like. And there's just a photo of one of their sessions where they're doing seat exercises. Another thing just to think about during this COVID-19 crisis is ICST, individualized CST. So just to recap on what we know about that, we did a big trial back in 2017 where ICST was delivered by family caregivers, and we found that it led to improvements in caregiver quality of life and the relationship between the person and their caregiver, but didn't have the same benefits to cognition and quality of life as group CST. More recently, we've just published a pilot study where we've actually got ICST delivered by trainee clinical psychologists, and we found significant improvements in cognition. So that was interesting, because I think it increases what we know about ICST. And what the second study did was rule out a lot of the problems we had in the first trial in terms of adherence and attendance, that a lot of people weren't sticking to the manual, weren't delivering all the sessions, and also that they weren't trained therapists, and the dynamics are very different. So I think it's starting to suggest that maybe ICST can lead to similar cognitive benefits, perhaps if delivered differently. So we haven't yet looked at the role of ICST remotely, but one of the important things to know about is the Thinkability app, which is a PhD student of Martin's, Harleen Rai, who's developing that. And it's an app available from the Apple Store, which has the ICST manual. It's based on the ICST manual, and the preliminary evaluation has confirmed that it seems to improve caregiver quality of life, similar to the ICST manual. There's a picture there. I would really recommend that manual as well, because it's very, very straightforward. There's a very good DVD which has very clear clips for people wanting to do it at home. So just in conclusion, I think we've got good evidence, anecdotal evidence for virtual CST so far. It's very early days, and I think we need clearer research to show feasibility and acceptability, and we really need some clearer guidelines on implementation, including who is eligible and who might benefit, how the programme should be adapted in terms of the sessions, which platform to use, general IT considerations. And this could provide an important long-term option for people who can't access CST groups due to transport frailty, health problems, etc. So I think that it's worth doing this research beyond the pandemic. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, firstly, if we do get funding, we might be recruiting through the NHS. So there's some email addresses there of people to contact if you're interested in being a recruitment site. If anyone here has tried virtual CST groups and wants to join the focus group discussion on the 10th of July, please email Cern or Luke. Keep an eye out for updates on the international CST website, and also there's the clip courtesy of Memory Matter Southwest. There's a link there. I really encourage you to watch that. So thank you.
Thanks, Amy. That was really great. And just mention also, for anybody's interested, that Gary and Kathy Perry have got an editorial coming out on aging and mental health, which is about CST by Zoom during the COVID crisis. So they're talking about the impact of lockdown, and also how you can use CST in a different way. So we'd like to, I think, move on now. I'm keeping an eye on the time. We can probably have some time for questions at the end. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Janet Carter, who's Associate Professor in Old Age Psychiatry at UCL. And Janet's going to be talking to us about people with young onset dementia and some of the issues in the COVID crisis and recent research. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Janet.
I'm not actually talking about COVID, actually, as something slightly different. I'm actually talking about research developments which are relevant to young onset dementia, but hopefully that might be useful for people. Can everybody see my screen okay, and see my slides?
Yeah, it looks good, thanks.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks for asking me to join the webinar, and thanks to Martin and the team for inviting me. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about some new research developments which were relevant to young onset dementia. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about a large project, so the largest UK project on young onset dementia to date, which was called the Angela Project. And this is a project which is a collaboration between a number of universities and a number of charities in the sector. And the project is designed to think about improving diagnosis and support specifically for young people living with dementia and their families. But the goal is really to try to develop an evidence base which we can translate into practical tools which we can use in the clinic day to day, and develop maybe new ways of working around young onset dementia. So the main questions from the study, which was about trying to improve diagnosis and support, were first of all to see, could we identify some particular indicators, maybe asked experts in the field to tell us what's the best way to try to make a high quality diagnosis of young onset dementia. So can we identify indicators which would help us with that? Secondly, can we find out what matters most to patients when they're on the receiving end of getting a diagnosis, and can we improve the patient experience? And then we want to do a benchmarking exercise where we look at how well are services across the UK actually performing in terms of diagnosis, and to benchmark them against these quality indicators which were devised by a set of clinical experts. And then finally, if I've got time, I'll try to talk a little bit about what we understand works best for people in terms of support after receiving a diagnosis. And everything I'm going to talk about today is available in a leaflet on the Young Dementia UK website, where there's a page devoted to the Angela Project. So you might find that helpful to download. In addition to what I'm talking about today, the leaflet also contains some recommendations about service design and development and care planning for young people living with dementia. So this is a very brief overview of what the Angela Project looked like. I'm not going to be talking about all aspects of it, but I'm going to be talking about the left side of the circle, which is about the 2 Delphi studies and the case note audit. And just to rehearse some of the arguments, I won't go into it in too much detail, because I know most people will be familiar with this. But one of the reasons for looking at young onset dementia is because there are significant psychosocial and clinical differences to dementia in later life. And the psychosocial differences are mainly related to getting a diagnosis at a particular stage of life and the different needs that younger people have. And the clinical differences are related to things like there being rare causes, genetic causes, clinical heterogeneity, etc. And we know that generally patients often get quite a poor experience, that there's a high frequency of misdiagnosis and under investigation. And in this era, maybe also what's relevant is that a lot of younger people are diagnosed primarily in older adult mental health services. And those assessments are routinely tailored towards older patients, not necessarily tailored to identify complexity in diagnosis for younger people. So we set about doing 2 Delphi studies. The first of these is called a Delphi Pro, short for Delphi Professional, which was essentially asking a lot of international clinical experts, how do you make an accurate diagnosis of dementia? What are the key factors you should be looking for as a clinician when you're seeing a patient in clinic? And then we did a mirror study where we looked at, asked people living with young onset dementia, recently diagnosed, about their individual experience of being on the receiving end of getting a diagnosis, what mattered most to them about the process. And these 2 Delphi studies together were designed to help us develop some new standards about good practice in diagnosis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those then, and then talk about the audit where we benchmark current practice against these standards. So just very briefly, I won't go into the details of what a Delphi study actually is, but in terms of the Delphi Professional, we had 23 international clinical experts in the field from all sorts of different backgrounds: neurology, psychiatry, neuropsychology, geriatrics, etc. People who you might expect to be involved in a multidisciplinary team. And we asked them to complete the Delphi study. And essentially the Delphi study is an iterative questionnaire which goes backwards and forwards between the researchers and the clinical experts, constantly refining judgment about what might be some key indicators that the clinical experts feel should be included in the clinic workup when you're seeing a patient with dementia, and the idea, young onset dementia. And the idea is really to help professionals translate their professional experience into clinical decision making. So they're forced to make a consensus on a number of statements. So for example, they get an option to see for a particular statement what other professionals in a different specialty might think about a statement, and that might help them readjust their own personal view. So essentially forcing consensus. And in our Delphi study, we agreed that you had to have 80% of the experts agreeing upon a standard for it to be included in the overall standards, for it to make the cut essentially at the end. And sorry, just to go back, so at the end of this process, we ended up with 11 standards, which we called a minimum standard because all the experts agreed about them, and then a gold standard where there were 33 indicators where 80% of the experts agreed, came to consensus that these standards were important. And this is just to give you a very quick example of what some of those standards might look like. So for example, in terms of psychiatric history and symptom inquiry in the clinic, all the things in grey reached 80% consensus. In the next slide, as you can see, this is to do with imaging. 100% of the experts felt, yes, we should do baseline structural neuroimaging. 80% of them felt we should be doing MRI to a specific dementia protocol. And they didn't reach consensus about volumetric analysis of medial temporal lobe atrophy on MRI imaging. And then at the bottom of the screen, this is just to show you some examples of statements that didn't actually reach consensus, just to show you the huge breadth of statements that were actually considered during the process. So for example, things like biomarkers, CSF analysis for biomarkers, amyloid PET didn't make the cut, nor did things like mood inventory, doing screenings for autoimmune disorders, for example. So it was a wide-ranging Delphi study. So in essence, we ended up with what we called a minimum standard, which is on the screen for you. So this was the 11 indicators that the experts felt were absolutely essential or highly important. And they're pretty straightforward. I think most of us would say, well, yes, we do these things when we see a patient in the clinic. The first of them is not a standard. It's actually a statement about a sort of philosophy of care. And it was clear from the Delphi Professional study that the clinical experts really identified a tension between trying to make a quick diagnosis because they were aware of delays, but also understanding that it was important to remain open to review and potentially modify opinion as things changed over time. And this was because they understood how profound an impact making a diagnosis of dementia in a young person is. So there was a very important approach to the philosophy of care about how the experts felt they should conduct a clinical interview. So those were the minimum standards. And this is just to give you an example of some of the gold standard indicators. I can't show you them all because there's 33 of them, but there's a paper just come out today actually in the Orange Journal, which you can read all these standards if you're interested in looking. So once we get on to more sophisticated gold standards, now we're thinking about pre-assessment counselling, we're thinking about what types of neuropsychological assessment might we include, what sort of physical signs or we might look for on a neurological examination. You can see that we're becoming a lot more comprehensive and detailed in terms of making an accurate diagnosis. So the next step then was to do our case note audit. So we had a whole series of what we're calling sort of quality standards or indicators, which we were going to benchmark against what actually is happening in terms of UK practice today. So the case note audit, this is not a manual audit. This was done through a digital platform called UK CRIS, which is a clinical research and interactive system. And it's a digital platform which allows you to identify anonymized patient notes. And we were very lucky in that we had 8 NHS trusts that helped us with the study, all anonymized. And we had 402 case notes of people with a current diagnosis of young onset dementia. These are the groupings. As you can see, most people had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And this is a quick overview of the compliance with the standards that we identified. So on the right-hand side of the screen, this was the percentage compliance across 8 NHS trusts with the minimum standard. So that was the 11 indicators that I mentioned, I showed you earlier, about 36% compliance. And on the left-hand side of the screen, compliance with the gold standard, the slightly more sophisticated assessments, and about 42% of notes met compliance for that standard. So there were some differences across the sites, which we're exploring at the moment, which I won't go into. But in terms of being able to find the information, the CRIS system is a highly sophisticated platform. It's got natural language processing, and essentially it allows you to identify terms in unstructured text, which is written by clinicians in the clinic. So this is about going through RIO case notes, progress notes, or case notes, whatever system you use, and looking at the text that clinicians were entering during their clinical encounters. And these are the compliance figures. So what do people do well or not so well on? So the highest scoring indicators, these were the things that people found quite easy to identify, and we could find them easily in the case notes. These were the top 5. So reassuringly, people were asking about symptom type and mode of onset, etc. They're the top 5 for you. And these were the things that people struggled a little bit more about, or we couldn't find information about, whether people had done neurological exams, asked about FTD criteria, etc. So please do think about looking in the Orange Journal if you're interested in finding a little bit more about those indicators. I can talk about a bit more about them in Q&A if people are interested. But we then did a mirror study, because obviously it's helpful to understand what clinicians think about what's important, but actually we're also interested to understand what matters most to younger people and their families when they go through the process, through the diagnostic process, what matters most to them about that clinical experience. And so we did a mirror study, again using a Delphi methodology, with 36 young people and family members or supporters in total. And we asked them specific questions about referral, assessment and diagnosis. And they rated 27 statements, which they felt were absolutely essential, very important in terms of those three parts of the process. And this is just to summarize some of the factors for you, which I've highlighted. So we've divided them into factors which are functional factors. That's factors to do with the actual process in the clinic. So about the convenience, for example. I've highlighted some in yellow, which I thought might be helpful for people to see, particularly people who are running services. You can see that people felt it was important they should have convenient appointment times. There should be a speeding up of the referrals from GPs to first assessment. Having a single point of contact throughout the process was important, and more awareness in terms of knowledge of dementia subtypes in mental health trusts. And then in terms of relational aspects of care, so these are the other sets of standards that young people told us were really mattered to them when they were receiving a diagnosis. And this were really about feeling informed or listened to, and very, very much about the clinician's communication style when the diagnosis was fed back. Interestingly, in the COVID era, as you can see on the screen, people felt it was actually very important to meet in person, and the communication should be with clinicians ideally in person, although that's going to prove difficult, I guess, for the future. But a very much an emphasis upon the sensitivity with which diagnosis was relayed. Many people had had quite a aversive experience of receiving a diagnosis, and they felt that compassion and empathy and sensitivity were particularly important, as well as having opportunities to speak separately and privately, and clinicians not using medical terms. So that's a summary of the Delphi studies, which hopefully is of interest to you. And I'm just going to finish by, in my last 2 slides, talking about the other part of the Angela project, which was about experiences of support after diagnosis. And this was a very large national survey, 850 examples of experiences, a significant number of focus groups across the UK, and individual interviews. And these are some key points which I thought people might find relevant about individual patient experience. So interestingly, a significant proportion of people who were diagnosed in neurology had had no specific follow-up after diagnosis. 40% of people couldn't identify any health professional that they'd seen in the previous 3 months. Only a small proportion were actually seeing young onset dementia specialists. And the costs of care were pretty huge. So this was a proper cost analysis. Family members were providing significant amount of care in terms of cost compared with statutory services at the bottom of your screen. And most carers were providing at least 5 hours of support. And despite that, a very significant proportion, almost 70%, had no services to provide care for them, for their relatives, so that they could have a break. So quite an interesting set of personal experience about this current state of post-diagnostic support for younger people in the UK. And then finally, what were the things that people thought were significantly associated with satisfaction? What made a positive experience? And the positive experience was made by having a named person to contact, being managed in a specialist young onset service, living in the southeast for some reason, and reporting nobody or only having a GP involved in your care on an ongoing basis was associated with significantly low satisfaction. And overall, in terms of all our quality indicators for satisfaction, specialist young onset services came out way ahead. So in terms of regularity of appointments, continuity of care, having care plans, general satisfaction, specialist young onset services outperformed every other type of service. So what next? Well, the plans for the Angela project are to use all that highly valuable information to try to develop specific pro formas, templates, educational tools, care plans, audit tools, based directly upon this very rich evidence base. And we're working currently with the Young Dementia Network, who are our main colleagues, to convert all this evidence into usable tools, for example, that clinicians and services could use day to day to try to improve the quality of their care. So thank you very much for your attention. My email address is on there if you want to contact me. And there's a quick summary of some recent publications from the Angela project, which people may be interested in. The copies of the slides will be available. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Janet. That's really excellent. I've seen the Angela project over a period of time, and it's very important and exciting to see the new results coming out and each new step of the project. So we're very lucky to have you here to tell us about that. We had a question from the participants, was about, can you tell us about support for families where there's a parent with young onset dementia and they have young children? Has that come up in your project?
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Sorry, I'm just unmuting myself. Yes, so in the individual experiences in this survey, we did indeed have young people who were caring for a family member with young onset dementia. We haven't drilled down into the data to look specifically at the feedback from them, but in is a very important part of what we do and what we're interested in. So we hope to be able to drill down into that data set and develop maybe more information about the specifics of the characteristics of people who are in a caring role, for example. But yes, so watch this space, I guess, is the answer to that. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean you do have a lot of really important data. So there'll be, I think, important results coming out for some time ahead. Yeah. So well, Janet, that was really excellent. Thank you very much, and for joining us. I know you only kind of came on the ticket a few days ago, but that's really nice. And I'd now like to move on to Lorraine Brown.
Oops. Yes.
Hi, Lorraine.
Okay.
Hello. So I'd like to welcome you, Lorraine.
Hello.
Lorraine was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease in August 2014. And as I said earlier, you're a mother to 3 girls and also grandmother. And you've worked in the NHS for many years at Medway Hospital. And now you're an Alzheimer's Society ambassador. So it's lovely to have you with us, Lorraine. Thank you for being here. So can you hear me okay?
Yes,
yeah, great.
Yes.
So Lorraine, we've got some questions for you about what life has been like during the COVID lockdown. So how have things been different for you during COVID-19?
Firstly, I miss not spending quality time with my 3 daughters and 2 grandchildren and other family members. Another important factor in my life during COVID-19 is the closure of dementia groups and meetings held in public buildings. My journey with Alzheimer's disease led me to meeting new friends within my dementia world. Some friends have become an extended family. I miss them terribly. I miss not socialising and spending time with them. I have also found that my established daily routine has dramatically altered in these past few months. It has been extremely draining to create a different daily routine to fit in with the present climate. Another change is the way I communicate with others via video webinars, meetings, and social interactions on WhatsApp video calls. Thank you.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think there's nothing like actually hearing it directly from somebody who's been going through this. So can you tell us, how could services have improved the situation for you?
Yes. Alzheimer's Society contact people with dementia in each local area on a regular basis. Telephone calls are made by staff, members and volunteers. Services could and still could make contact with people with a dementia diagnosis, especially when living alone and have become isolated because of the coronavirus. Improvement has happened with technology using Zoom, LifeSize, and other virtual video sites. The key message to other services is to make contact and ask questions on a well-being and any mental health issues they may have. Communication is the key for me.
Okay, so thank you very much. So it's kind of knowing somebody's there and checking how you are and anything you need. So so what would you have liked services? You were saying that services have been in touch with you a bit, but what would you have liked services to do differently compared to what you had?
I would have liked all services to take an active role to contact and communicate with people that have been diagnosed with a cognitive disability. Thank you.
Okay. So the last question, is there anything that you've benefited from that you would like services to continue to do post-lockdown?
Yes. For me, to continue to use virtual video sites such as Zoom and LifeSize. It's a wonderful way to connect on these video platforms. It enables and promotes confidence at one's own pace to step forward in the new reality. Video conferencing with professionals and peers have made a big difference to my well-being and mental health. I am very pleased to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. That's excellent, and I think it's, like I said, it's so important for us to hear directly about what your views are and your experiences are, and you know, the things that might be a benefit in the future, because we won't always be in this situation, but there may be some things that are different afterwards. I know I'll be using Zoom more and conferences like that. So I'm now looking at the questions and answers, and so I'm wondering, Lorraine, you said you're happy to take some further questions. I'm wondering if it might be possible for people to post some questions online, and we could also have questions for Janet and Amy, because we didn't really have much chance for questions for those. So I think there was one question for so there's a question for you, Lorraine. I think I know the answer, which is, are you looking forward to coming out of lockdown?
I am actually. I'm very excited to come out of lockdown, but it needs to be very slowly. And information, this again, services could provide what is the new information and how we're going about things.
Yes.
Yes.
And I hope you'll be able to see your family soon.
I have actually, because my middle daughter lives nearby, and what's been created now is a bubble where two families can meet each other, and I think I almost crushed her bones when I hugged her and kissed her. And that was the most delightful memory so far.
Yeah. Well, that's lovely. I mean, I was hearing about bubbles from friends in New Zealand, but we hadn't had one yet. And then we started having bubbles a few weeks ago. So right. So it's been a very stimulating and interesting and useful seminar so far. And I wonder, do we have any other people? Anybody like to post questions or post things in the chat that we could ask? There's we've had a few questions come up. I'm trying to keep an eye on them. We've got Lorraine here, who's happy to take further questions. There's also Janet and Amy, who've given such good presentations for us. And we've had over 100 people. I see. We've had I think we hit 104 participants. Now we're on 98. But it's a lot of people to be in a webinar, and I'm very grateful to the MSNAPers for organising this third one. I think they've all gone really well so far. Any other questions or points people have? Just see something's come up. Somebody's asking about a video clip of the CST session. I think actually, Amy, the link is on your slides, isn't it? you said that there's a...
Yeah, that's right. There's a link of the virtual CST sessions on the last slide of my presentation. Yeah. I think if you Google, if you go onto YouTube and you look for CST, there's also other things that you can find. There's some posts there through Age UK which have examples of real life sessions as well.
Okay, so we've got Q&A, and somebody's asked about a comparison of MSNAP and the Young Dementia UK standards. I think it would be useful to, I suppose, have a look at the memory services standards in MSNAP, Janet, and the Young Dementia. I mean, you've come out with the key standards, haven't you? The gold standards as well as the basic ones. But it would be good to see how those map across on MSNAP. I've got a few more things in the Q&A. Somebody said how useful it is sharing Lorraine's experience, and has asked if you prefer face-to-face or virtual contacts. Now, I think, Lorraine, you were saying it's much nicer to see people, but yeah, do you want to comment, Lorraine? Face-to-face or virtual contacts?
Well, in the ideal world, which is not right now, it would be, I miss seeing my peers, I miss seeing my family, absolutely. But this is the next best thing. And I'm not sure how my mental health would have held out if it hadn't been for these meetings. And I find them very valuable. In fact, I have a life size with NHS or Zoom with others every day, and that helps tremendously with my daily life. I am able to actually have a conversation with people, and it's brilliant.
Yeah, well that's really helpful to know, Lorraine, because obviously before, one of the problems before we had lockdown and the COVID crisis was people feeling isolated and not seeing many people during the week. And I guess maybe people can have a mixture of actual visits and seeing people, and sometimes perhaps if family are a long way away, to see them on Zoom and, you know, have a regular chat, which is nice. Janet, there's a question for you, which is about genetic counselling for the family and also the prognosis of young onset dementia. You there, Janet? Okay. We're getting a mixture of chat and Q&A. Is Janet's okay? Okay, maybe Janet's just popped out for a second. So so there's a question for Lorraine. Lorraine, did you have specific help around young onset dementia, or were you seen through the kind of older person services?
My journey started because I worked in the crisis team at Medway Hospital. I was sent to Dr. Mummery. She's a neurologist at Queen Square, London. So my journey through going to dementia services were a little different, perhaps, from some. But my conclusion took 3 years. It was 3 years to reach a conclusion. And with this, I was not happy with the diagnosis because I knew what it would mean, job loss, etc. So I had a second opinion, which was the same. I went to my local memory group just for a while, 6 weeks or so, and then transferred to my GP for a once-a-year dementia review.
Gosh.
The only person I see is actually, face to face, well, not now because it's not the times, is my GP. Nobody else. No one. No.
Thank you for telling us that. It does. No. It does remind us how often people are, I suppose, diagnosed and said, you know, and then not really followed up by specialist services, which is a point that Janet brought up. We've got very nice comment from Fiona in the Highlands, who says that she lives and works in the Highlands, and being able to attend good quality events from her home, or brackets garden, is wonderful. So she's hoping it continues beyond COVID. I think that's a great idea, Fiona, and I think they've gone. We've had over 100 people to many of these sessions. Somebody's asked about Maureen's asked about providing tablets with CST apps uploaded. And training for patients or families. I know the international CST. Well, I know with the CST book for families, the ICST book, there is a DVD in there which is meant to be for so families can actually train and orientate themselves. And the apps are available, but I don't think we're going to be able to give people computer tablets. But I mean, there's but the app's available in Google Play and the iStore. See how more questions we've got. There's a question for Aimee about how closely do people have to follow the manual? I know it's a question that's come up before.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I think the manual is, we attempted to have a balance where it was structured around key principles and there was a kind of clear format, but also flexible according to the group who you have. So every time you do one particular session, it might look very, very different depending on who is in the group. I think if you really move very strongly away from the manual, it might be a positive experience, but it's hard to know whether it's going to have the same effects. So we created the manual because people were doing lots of similar kinds of activities, and we wanted to know in what format they were effective. And we do know that if you follow this manual, the effects are likely to be there. If you move hugely away from it, it's harder to know that. So I think the answer is it certainly needs to be adhered to as much as possible, but in a way that's flexible for that group.
So I think I'll just echo that. I mean, there have been, you know, you may need to alter the content of the sessions sometimes, depending on the kind of group you're getting, according to their, you know, their genders or their backgrounds. So, but it's mainly, I think, about trying to keep the structure and keeping to the key principles. We don't want to go too far off, really. So we've got a comment that there's a 6-month project in Surrey using technology to monitor physical health and connect with services. That sounds very interesting. There's another question for Aimee, which I think probably I can answer, which is there's 14 sessions in the main manual. I think there's another 24 in the maintenance CST manual. So that's between them, that's whatever 14 and 24 is. It's nearly 40 sessions. And there's also the ICST manual has about 75. So if you want further ideas and inspirations, there's lots of material out there, and I'm hoping that's useful. And there's also lots of contacts on the International CST website. Just got a few minutes left here. From Sarah, who says, doing some CST Zoom sessions, they're going well, but often the family joins as well to help with the audio and hearing. A lot more relaxed and less structured than face-to-face CST. We're hoping that as time goes on, we can offer something more like CST. Keen to be involved in the research. Well, you'll see that comment, Aimee, on the Q&As. And looks like you've been muted. Twice weekly contact is once a week acceptable. Aimee, do you want to answer that? I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm unmuted now. Good question. When we developed CST, we developed it twice a week for 7 weeks. We've never systematically there have been small studies looking at it once a week that haven't shown the same effects, but we haven't done a big enough trial to really categorically say one way or another. But what we did find, we did a survey which is hopefully going to be published soon on UK memory services last year. We had about 56 responses, and we were asking how people were delivering CST, and we found that approximately half the services were offering it once a week and half were offering it twice a week. I think twice a week isn't always feasible. What we find as another option is having both sessions on the same day, but with a gap in between, maybe a lunch break or something, because often it's the transport and logistics of getting people in twice. So that's one way around it. But certainly a lot of anecdotal feedback for once a week is positive, although we don't have the research evidence.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. I think we're pretty much out of time now. So can we thank Lorraine and Janet and Amy for such great presentations, and also we'd like to thank the MSNAP team again for organising this webinar. They've been extremely popular, and let's hope we have some more in the pipeline. Thanks a lot. Okay, bye bye everybody. Thank you.